Okay, we'll get started. Welcome everyone to another in our speaker series of the Paterson Museum Foundation. My name is Glenn Corbett. I'm the president of the Paterson Museum Foundation. We're a 501c3 that supports the Paterson Museum through artifact acquisition, preservation, documentation, a variety of different ways that we help the museum effectively as a friends group for the museum. We've been around a few years now, and this is one of the things that we wanted to try to do is offer up educational opportunities to the public, and what better way through Zoom that we've all gotten so used to during the COVID event that we've all been living through for the last few years. So one further announcement I just want to make here. Our next speaker series event will be in March, on March 22nd at 7 p.m. And that'll be Richard Poulton, who's going to walk us through Paterson's Victorian architecture. So that'll be an interesting presentation. For those of you who have been following us for a while, you know we also have, as I mentioned, another series with Ed Smike. It's called Stories Behind the Stories, Chats with Passaic County historian Ed Smike. And he is going to be, in a very short period of time, we'll be putting out some announcements of some of the new ones coming up. And I heard through the grapevine that we might be seeing Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain, coming up in the not too distant future. So our Facebook page and the Paterson Museum's Facebook page are the places to see these events announced. They all start at 7 o'clock. And most importantly, the young lady with us tonight, Heather Garside, she is the wizardress behind the curtain very often. She's the one who actually does in fact post all these Zoom sessions to YouTube. So if you miss any, you aren't here for one, you can thank her for putting them up. So we've got several up there already if you haven't seen them, and please take a look. So so without further ado, I'll announce, or I'll turn it over to Heather. Just so, if for those of you who don't know Heather, she is the curator of the Paterson Museum. She formerly, some of you might remember, worked with the Passaic County Historical Society up at Lambert Castle as their director. So we're so pleased to have her here tonight. She's done a lot of work on this presentation. We know it's a story that most people don't know about. And so we're so excited to have her talk to us about Minerva Miller, who in effect is sort of the Rosa Parks of Paterson. So
I
anyway,
hate when people say that.
Well, I say it only because
it gives a good context. Yeah,
it does give a good context here. She is, and she's much earlier than Rosa. So anyway, without spilling all her beans, let me turn it over to Heather. So Heather, take it away. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Glenn, and welcome everybody. I'm really excited to do this presentation and introduce you all to Minerva Miller, who is someone that I have gotten to know a little bit better since I started here at the Paterson Museum. To begin, I just want to mention that this presentation is not just going to be about Minerva Miller and her trial, which I'll tell you, her lawsuit, which I'll tell you a lot about in a minute, but it's also going to be just as much about my journey to sort of find more out about her. I first Minerva first came on my radar in early 2020 when I was working on a Black history exhibit for the museum here. And she was mentioned vaguely in an 1980s article about Black History Month that was just sort of like 10 fun facts about Paterson's Black history you probably didn't know. And that was sort of it. It just sort of said Minerva Miller's trial, very important to civil rights in New Jersey. So I decided to do a little more digging. At the time of the exhibit, I didn't find a whole lot more information, but what I did learn about her trial really intrigued me. So after the exhibit, I decided that I wasn't done digging, and I've continued to sort of search for her in the records to try and see if I could kind of uncover her as a person. But first, what's so important about Minerva Miller that I find her so intriguing to continue to dig? Well, on September 22nd, 1911, Minerva Miller decided that she wanted to go and see a movie. She and two friends, Mrs. Anderson and Mrs. Newman, walked up to the ticket counter at the Paterson Show and put down 15 cents for the Nickelodeon, 5 cents a piece. And the woman at the counter told them that the theater charged 25 cents a ticket for African-American patrons. And so they were refused entry unless they could produce the rest of the money. a conversation ensued, and then other witnesses were involved, and some people tried to sort of help Minerva get entry, but end of the line was Minerva Miller and her party did not enter the movie theater that night. Following the incident, Minerva decided that she was going to sue the theater for their treatment. And on November 17th of 1911, the case came up in the Passaic District Court. Minerva's lawyer was a man named Robert Buckley, and he used an 1884 New Jersey statute that said that citizens cannot be discriminated against as the basis for his case. But he was clear from the beginning and in all of his arguments that segregation once you were in the theater had nothing to do with the case. The case was solely on charging different fees for entry based on race. The final decision for the case came very quickly at 9 p.m. on November 24th. Now, this was a case that didn't have a jury, so the judge, who was named was Walter Carrington Cabell, made the decision himself, and he ruled in Minerva's favor. Minerva won $500, which was the maximum penalty at that level that she could be awarded, and that, if you do the math, is 10,000 tickets at 5 cents a piece. And it also is about $14,000 in today's money, just to give you a reference. The case did go on to the appeals court in June of 1912, but the original decision was upheld in Minerva's favor. And as a result, this case set a precedent for future civil rights cases in New Jersey. And it seems to have been a case that sort of got attention and people knew was going to be significant at the time it was happening. One of the papers reported during the trial that, quote, the court was filled with colored people when the case was opened, end quote. So a lot of people seemed to know that something big was going down and wanted to be witnesses of it. So now I think you can kind of get a sense of why I think Minerva's, a little more interesting than the average woman in 1911. She was very gutsy for all of her actions. And just to give you an idea of how gutsy she was, we don't have a lot of her own words, but we do have a few quotations from her testimony in the trial. And the lawyer for the defense, who we'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit, one of his arguments was that they could not claim that she was being discriminated against because of race, because there was no proof that Minerva Miller was an African American, because she was very light-skinned. And Minerva is quoted in the newspaper as saying, from the stand, "Yes, I am a Negro, and you can tell that by my flat nose and my kinky hair," which I think is a pretty bold statement, once again, for a woman, especially a woman of color, to be saying on the stand in 1911. And so I think that kind of shows her as this sort of definitely not a pushover. She was sort of someone that stood up for herself, which I really like. And that's the kind of who I'm looking for and decided to look for when I did my research. So just quickly, here are some of the secondary sources where you can kind of see Minerva mentioned. As I said, just because few of us have heard of her, it's not like she's completely obscure. She does have a mention in the Encyclopedia of New Jersey. She's also mentioned in a book called Jerseyana, The Underside of New Jersey History. And she was also, I found reference to her in a publication entitled Black Women's Christian Activism Seeking Social Justice in a Northern Suburb. And all of these sources, all they seem to do is really just sort of repeat the trial facts from the newspaper in their own words. They kind of add a little bit of interpretation as to what this meant moving forward for the state of New Jersey, but they don't really add anything, any new information to the story. They don't seem to have researched any deeper than the 4 or 5 articles that I found myself. So I decided that I wanted to look more deeply at the trial myself and see if I could find any more clues to uncovering Minerva Miller. I started by looking at her lawyer. Robert L. Buckley, Esquire, was Minerva's lawyer, as I mentioned. Newspaper accounts of the trial indicated that Buckley, quote, addressed the court in one of the most eloquent, convincing, and stirring summings up heard in the Passaic District Court, end quote. His office was located in 129 Market Street, and it was on one of the upper floors of the Paterson Savings Institution building, which I have a picture of here. So you can imagine him looking out the window in one of these offices. He was listed in several newspaper articles and publications as a prominent Paterson attorney, and he also was very active in the Democratic Party. He served in as a New Jersey assemblyman in 1913, and he passed away in June of 1942. I found his obituary, which makes no mention to his involvement in Minerva's trial, or the fact that it was considered a groundbreaking piece of civil rights legislation. At least on this sort of quick glance at Buckley, we don't really see anything that leads us to any closer to finding more information about Minerva. Next, I decided to look a little bit more closely at the judge, Judge Cabell. Again, the newspaper accounts have a quote for him. They quoted him as saying, "There is no doubt from the plaintiff's case that the spirit of the act, as well as the letter, has been violated, and the person guilty of that violation must be punished." This is pretty strong feeling on his ruling. Walter Carrington Cabell was considered an important and significant person in Passaic County. He made it in the publication Who's Who in Passaic County in 1917, which included small bios and photographs of prominent individuals in our area. He had a private law practice in Passaic, and he served as the judge for the Passaic District Court from 1911 to 1926. So he was fairly new to the bench when Minerva's case came over to him. He was first appointed to that bench by Woodrow Wilson, who was then governor of New Jersey. And he too, like Buckley, was active in the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, while he ran for several different political offices throughout his life, he was never elected to anything. When he finished with the law and retired, he moved to Vermont to live on a farm, and that's where he died of a heart attack in 1945. One interesting piece of information about Cabell that sort of piqued several journalists' interest was that he had Southern origins. He had been born in Amherst, Virginia, and his father had actually been in the Confederate cavalry, but the family had moved to Jersey City when Walter was 2 years old. So he wasn't down south for very long, but that doesn't mean that his family's biases didn't sort of affect him as he grew. And there are the two newspaper articles that I found that really exploited this sort of angle to the case. Were both printed in the 1960s and sort of, looking back 50 years ago from two separate papers. And in these articles, if you read them, it's like, yeah, there was this case about this African-American woman, but Judge Cabell, he sort of hijacks the story completely. But one of the things that I found in this article that was really helpful was they mentioned a letter to the editor in 1911. So I went back and found that letter to the editor, and it was written by another African-American citizen of Paterson, a man named William Green. And in his letter, he writes, quote, "The colored people of New Jersey owe to Judge Cabell a great debt of gratitude, and that he was enough of a judge to set a precedent in the state of New Jersey upholding the civil rights of the Black man," end quote. So that's kind of, going along with what I had indicated and what I felt I was reading from the original accounts, that people seem to understand the significance of this case in real time as it was happening. Once again, I think that, these papers, while they're not really focusing on Minerva, which was frustrating, since she's definitely the hero of this story, and they chose to instead to focus on the judge, it is an interesting point that they bring up, that he held up this case despite the fact that he may have had sort of biases in the opposite direction because of his Southern parentage. Now, what about the other side of the courtroom? Well, the Paterson Show was listed in 1910 and 1911 directory as a moving picture house. And you can see it here in the Sanborn Atlas from 1915, and it was located at 136 Market Street. So actually not that far away from Robert Buckley's office. And that is pretty much all I could find out about the theater. From one of the articles I read seemed to indicate that the theater sort of closed, but then reopened with the same owner under a different name later. I didn't find a lot of evidence to support that one way or the other. And I was unable to find any photographs or ads related to the theater. The newspaper also listed several names related to the theater. They mentioned that the owner was a man named Mr. Stapleton, the manager was a Mr. Adams, and that it was a Mrs. Lena Moore, who was the cashier who had refused entry to Minerva and her party. I did try to find Mr. Stapleton and see if I could connect him to the theater. However, the city directory for that year didn't have anybody with the last name of Stapleton who seemed to be indicated as a proprietor of a theater. So it's possible that he either wasn't listed or he didn't live in Paterson. But that didn't really seem to be a very helpful lead. So I sort of abandoned that pretty quickly. And I decided that the other employees and their, details was probably not really going to add much to the story either. So I sort of decided to explore the next angle, which was the Mr. Stapleton's lawyer. So this is the defense attorney, James Carroll. Unlike Buckley, Carroll had no clear position in his argument for the defense, and he was sort of all over the place and bringing up many different sort of arguments. As I mentioned, in his line of questioning included questioning whether or not Minerva was even African-American to begin with, and bringing into question her race and how she could prove her race. Carroll was an Irish Catholic, and he was appointed to the position of recorder in 1907. He was the youngest man to be given that position, and recorder was basically a municipal judge in the city of Paterson. So he worked very closely in that position with the Paterson police. And Carroll, while he was recorder, was the person who was doling out sentencing for anyone who came into court for any reason, which included all of the picketing strikers during Paterson's 1913 silk strike. He was famously hard on the nonviolent strikers in that strike, and he often gave them the maximum penalties whenever he could. So one of the men who was arrested during that strike, a man named John Reed, described Carroll as having, quote, an intelligent, cool, and merciless face. Now, Carroll may have gone on to do great things, but unfortunately, he died in 1919 as a part of the influenza epidemic. So very young and seemingly promising career, was thought in the papers at the time. Not the nicest guy if you're looking at things from sort of a social perspective, but he made whatever mark he could, and he passed away very early. His obituary made no mention of his involvement in Minerva Miller's case either. And I find that interesting that of these three prominent white men in the law, none of their obituaries mention them being a part of this considered groundbreaking legislation for the state of New Jersey. So at this point in my research, I began to understand why so little was written about Minerva, and so little, additional details were added to about her case. And looking at the other people in the case didn't kind of add too much to the story. So I decided to go back to the newspapers and see if I could pluck any more details from them that might lead me to more biographical information about Minerva. The newspaper had, for example, listed the street she lived on, but it didn't give a house number. And in other quoted testimony by Minerva, she claimed that her father was a minister, quote, known throughout the world, and then mentioned that he had included in his preaching had included slaves in the cotton fields. One thing I discovered also returning to the newspapers and looking a little bit more closely is that the trial definitely got national attention. The articles are in the Paterson papers and the local papers, but the articles are being picked up in Colorado and Virginia, among other places. So while this wasn't like crazy national news, it also wasn't incredibly local and remote. Several witnesses were called during the trial, including a man named Thomas Braxton, who was listed in the paper as being a white friend of Minerva who had witnessed her attempted entry into the theater. Her husband's name is also listed in one of the articles as Lewis Miller. And they also mention, one of the articles indicates that there was a mass meeting of Paterson's African-American citizens who came together the night before the trial at the Colored Men's Association Hall. So all these sort of little pieces sort of gave me some tangents to sort of look for and work from. I began to search more widely in newspapers looking for Minerva Miller, and I found the odd article. But what I started to notice was that most of the hits that I was coming up with were from one newspaper in particular called the New York Age, which it turned out was a weekly African-American newspaper. And despite it being printed in New York City, the paper included columns of news on other towns in the area, which included several New York and New Jersey towns. And Paterson was listed almost every week with some sort of bits of news. And so that is where I sort of refined my search and started to have more success finding information about Minerva. So what I was able to uncover was, once again, really more tidbits and bits and pieces. I found that she'd participated at an AME Zion New Year's celebration in Pennsylvania, where she sang a duet with her sister, Mrs. H.R. Newman. Now, you may remember that I mentioned a Mrs. Newman as one of her friends at the movie theater. It's possible that that was her sister who was going to the movies with her on that fateful night in September. At another AME Zion event, this time in Paterson, she's listed as being the secretary of the Ladies Aid Society, which was in charge of the fancy booth at the church fair. In yet another review of, this time, the Cold Snap Social, Minerva is mentioned as the president of the Ladies Guild of the AME Zion Church. She's also mentioned in connection with the Household of Ruth, Lodge 1718, which was a women's auxiliary organization associated with the Odd Fellows, a fraternal organization. She's listed with the title of WR, which stands for Worthy Recorder, and I think essentially means secretary. And in another article that was reporting on the activities of the Colored Men's Citizens Association, which met once again in the Colored Men's Association Hall, they mentioned that there was going to be a debate on women's suffrage at their next meeting, and two ladies, Elizabeth Walker and Minerva Miller, would be presenting the affirmative side of the argument. She was also mentioned as having been asked to give a recitation at another meeting of the Citizens Association. And you'll remember, as I said, the Colored Men's Association Hall is where they met in solidarity to support her the night before the trial. And one of the most important articles that I found in this search was published on August 6th, 1921, and it was an annual report of the annual meeting of the New Jersey State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. And it mentioned in the body of the article that there was a memorial for several of their members who had passed in the past year, and that included Minerva Miller. So I now had a death date for her of sometime between 1920 and August 6th of 1921. So as I said, once again, we're just getting tiny glimpses at Minerva's life, just little pieces. But if we take a minute and think about what we've learned, we now know that she had at least one sister. She was clearly a very active member in her community, involved in several organizations. She was a leader and held offices in quite a few organizations. She was very active in her church, the AME Zion, both at the local level with her congregation, but also further afield in other states. She had some talent as a performer and was called upon on several occasions to recite and sing. And she definitely seems to have believed in and supported women's suffrage. And we see that not only from the debate, but also just her membership in the Colored Women's Club. And now, as I said, we know that she passed away sometime in 1920, 1921. So putting these little morsels together, Minerva as a person sort of begins to emerge a little bit from the fog of obscurity. Next, I focus my research on her husband, Lewis. I had his name and I had the street where they lived. So I started by looking in the city directories. I knew that Minerva Miller wasn't listed in the directories, but there were several Lewis Millers, and I was able to narrow down the search and find Minerva's Lewis simply because he was the only Lewis Miller who was living on Ellison Street at the time of the trial. And now that I had their address, 88 Ellison, I was able to work backwards and forwards in both directions. I searched for him in the city directories, and I discovered at that time that they had previously lived further down on Ellison Street at 92 Ellison. And I also learned that Lewis had several different occupations in his time in Paterson. During the trial, he was listed as being a janitor, but before that, he was listed as a waiter or bartender. It was both. So by researching and looking for Minerva's husband, I was able to find, as I said, where she lived. And this is the 1915 Sanborn Atlas again, showing 88 Ellison Street where she lived. And the directories indicated that they were renters and they didn't own their home. And I also found her and Lewis in the 1900 and 1910 census records, which told me that at least at that time, she had no occupation. It also told me that she was born in 1871, that her father had been born in Maryland and her mother had been born in New Jersey, and that she had a son sometime in 1903. So we now know that she was a mother at the time of the trial of a 10-year-old, or no, sorry, not a 10-year-old, 9-year-old boy. It also, these records confirmed that they rented their house and didn't own it. It also indicated that she could read and write, but had not attended school, and that they were married around 1892. So there they are, a little bit closer up. Minerva's family in 1910. Interestingly, they spell Lewis's name wrong. He spelt it Louis, and all of the census records spell it Lewis, which doesn't help when you're trying to search the records. The biggest piece of information, though, that I did find about Lewis in my search was I did find his obituary in 1915. So that kind of confirmed what I thought when I didn't find him listed in the 1916 directory. Lewis Miller had died on February 11th, 1915 at the age of 50, and he was buried in Laurel Grove Cemetery here in Paterson. But another article with Lewis's name attached to it ended up being just as important, as it opened up my next line of inquiry. In one article that I found was referencing the burial of a J. Harvey Anderson Jr., and the article listed Lewis Miller as the deceased's brother-in-law. So this was Minerva's brother who had passed away. And the article also spent a lot of time talking about the deceased's father, Reverend J. Harvey Anderson, and it indicated that he had previously been the pastor of the AME Zion Godwin Avenue Church in Paterson. And if you remember back to what I said about Minerva's testimony, she indicated that her father had been a minister and preached far and wide. So that seemed to connect clearly to what she had said. So now that I had his name and a few extra details about him, I was able to look for Minerva's father. Now I knew he was an AME Zion minister, and that he had once preached at the AME Zion Godwin Street Church. Minerva's census records told us that he was originally from Maryland, but that her mother was from New Jersey. I was able to find a brief church history of the Godwin Street congregation that listed him as the minister here in Paterson between 1892 and 1896. It also mentioned that under his leadership, and this is an image of the Godwin Avenue or Godwin Street Church. Under his leadership, the existing church building was torn down, but that he actually left before he had time to help them build a new church. I went to the city directory to look for a little bit more information about Reverend Anderson, but unfortunately he was only listed in one of the 4 years that he was here as the pastor, and it was 1896-97, and there he's listed as living at 259 Water Street. I did find, however, a very large mention of him in a publication called History of the American Negro, North Carolina edition, which had been written in 1921. His chapter, he had a whole chapter dedicated to him, actually started out with the following statement, quote, "A whole book instead of a sketch might be written about Reverend James Harvey Anderson Jr., end quote. The article goes on, or the chapter goes on to discuss his many accomplishments. He moved around a lot to many different congregations throughout the country, which apparently was fairly common with AME Zion ministers, especially those that were considered good ministers. They were sent around. So he spent some time in New York State, in Harlem, Hudson, Rochester, Binghamton, Troy. So he kind of hit all sections of New York State. He was also in Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Connecticut, North Carolina, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. Besides his career, the book goes on to talk a little bit about his early life. He was born in Frederick, Maryland, June 30th, 1848. And his father had been, or at the time of his birth was, a slave. It was kind of unclear. His mother's name was Minerva, and there was some indication in the publication that she may have either been part Caucasian or part Native American or both. And then it seemed to indicate that he had worked for a Union officer in 1862 and then either been moved south with the army, moved north with the army, or on his own enlisted in a colored regiment shortly thereafter. He also was self-educated. And besides his origins, the book goes on to talk about his wife. He married a woman named Julia Ann Moore of Paterson on March 10th in 1870. And the book claimed that they had 9 children together, and it lists several that they believed were living at the time of the publication, which included one daughter named Minerva Ann, who they listed with the occupation of a nurse in that publication. Besides that book, some of the newspaper articles I found indicated that the Reverend Anderson celebrated the 40th anniversary of being a minister while he was serving in Pennsylvania in 1913. And there was also another record of him returning to Paterson to bury yet another one of his children, a daughter named Emma, who was listed as an actress who had been living in Manhattan. And then I also did find his obituary, which indicated that he had returned to Paterson upon his retirement. He actually passed away on December 17th, 1929, at the age of 81. And the article indicated that he had had 15 children. There was only one daughter who survived him, as did his wife, and 4 grandchildren who were unnamed in that article. And the obituary talks a little bit about being a veteran and self-educated and also a member of the Masons, but some of the information in the obituary kind of seems to indicate things a little bit differently than the book, and it's kind of hard to cite because neither one of them give any indication of their original sources. So as you can see, they weren't exaggerating when they said that there could be a whole book written about the Reverend's life. And especially if we were to go into his ministerial accomplishments, it would be a lot, but that's definitely beyond the realm of this presentation. So now we need to kind of take a minute and ask ourselves, what do we learn about Minerva from the information that we know about her father? And we definitely have learned a lot about her family and her family tree. We know that she was possibly one of 15 siblings. And through various articles, I was able to determine the names of 6 of them. I wasn't able to find the names of all 15. We also learned her mother's name, and we also learned that it was her mother who had the connection to Paterson, which may be why when she married, Minerva decided to settle in Paterson rather than following her father and family around. And there's also the hint to why Minerva's name is Minerva. The origin of her name may be that she was named for her paternal grandmother. And there is also this hint of the possible Scottish or Native American ancestry in her genealogy, which may indicate that she did have a lighter skin tone, which might be why Carroll felt that he could bring her race into question during the trial. It's interesting that she may have worked as a nurse, although once again, this publication from North Carolina was the only source so far that I found that indicated that she had a profession. And we know that her parents were married in 1870, so her being born in 1871, she was either their oldest or very close to being one of the oldest children in the family. And we now have a middle name of Anne for her as well. So, and then there are also other aspects of Minerva's story that we can kind of infer a little bit based on the information that we know about her father. Her father being a minister definitely makes a lot of sense that she was so actively involved in the AME Zion Church. And the fact that she was active in communities beyond Paterson, as I mentioned, she went to Pennsylvania and was performing, could involve, just simply mean that she was visiting her father and attended his church in Pennsylvania. So that explains some of that. And also his leadership and the active role he took in his community throughout his life can kind of be seen as a reflection that may be what Minerva was sort of using as her example when she became so involved in so many different civic organizations in her own life. I would really love to tell you that these 3 women, or at least one of them, is Minerva Miller, civil rights pioneer and hero long before the civil rights movement existed, but I can't. We may never have a picture of Minerva Miller, and we may never learn more than the pieces of information that I was able to pluck out of the records and share with you tonight. The real question is, do these pieces that I've just sort of detailed to you tell us Minerva's story? And the answer to that question, I think, leads to a much larger question, which is, how do we define a person and a woman? You know, we know that Minerva was a mother, a daughter, a wife. You can learn about someone's career, their activities, and their education. But even when we have all those pieces and we put them together, is that really her as a person? And if we were talking about someone like Emily Dickinson or Sojourner Truth, we might have letters or diaries or accounts of her own words that would give us a better sense of who Minerva was. But with Minerva, you know, the only 2 things that we have in her own words are the 2 quotations that were done at the trial. And we really don't have a good sense of who she was from either of those, and a little bit. Um, and that kind of brings me to an important point that I'd like to make about researching, that I came to while researching Minerva. Whether we're researching women from the past or minorities from the past or people from low income situations, there's an extra layer to Minerva's story, and that's the story that I've sort of been detailing to you, the limited resources available to learn more about her. And that's not in any way exclusive to Minerva. The inequity of information, is commonly found when researching minorities and women. Every single person that I talked to when I started this research, when I was detailing, telling them about Minerva and that she's an African-American woman at the beginning of the 20th century, they kind of warned me that I wasn't going to be able to find a lot of information. And we all kind of knew it was going to be very difficult. And as the old saying goes, history is written by the victors, and that's true. Even in times of peace, there are still victors. There are those people who control the official narrative, whether they realize that's what they're doing or not. And it's those people who decide what does and doesn't get reported in newspapers or included in books. What's considered important enough to be recorded or retained in archives or in scrapbooks. And it's a problem that does definitely exist in the museum world. We would love to talk about more average citizens in Paterson from Paterson's past, but those people who were collecting material 40, 50, and 60 years ago used a cultural filter that sort of determined who was museum worthy and who was not. And often they deemed those people who were worthy of, retaining information and saving objects to be those people who were wealthy or politically connected. And, that often translates to mean that they were probably Caucasian and often men. So that's not to say that those collectors were doing that in any way maliciously, but the result is the same. And we've sort of lost a lot of the stories of the average citizens of Paterson, and I think across the board, across our country, and that's not to say that attitude isn't changing. It definitely is changing. And I'm happy to report, that a lot of collecting institutions, including our own, have sort of changed our approach. And we are trying to encompass and include more people and save more stories of everyday people who otherwise might not have been recorded. But in a lot of ways, it's too late to go back and gather information and save information about some people like Minerva Miller, even if we may want to expand and we think that she's worthy of learning more about. But just because it's difficult, that obviously doesn't mean that we need to stop searching. Are there other areas that I could explore? There are a lot of additional research sort of avenues that I could take. One thing that I find really fun about doing this kind of historical research is that with the digitization of collections, you could search for something today and search for it again next week and find more and different information sort of constantly. So I think that there is a chance that we can find more out about Minerva, especially if if I decided to examine a little bit more about her early life, I may find more about her childhood and things like that, and continue to sort of unravel her story, because I feel that it is a story that does deserve to be recorded and remembered. And we need to know more about her than just this sort of tiny snapshot of Minerva Miller from September 22nd to November 24th, 1911. So I would be happy to take questions now.
Okay. Thank you so much, Heather, for a wonderful presentation. I know you spent innumerable hours going through a variety of sources, particularly newspapers.com, to find all this information. It's really remarkable to think that, it's only recently that you're able to sort of uncover so many additional pieces to the puzzle here.
Yeah, I was actually doing a little more research yesterday and found more stuff that I hadn't found when I originally put
That's the wonders here. So Tamara's got a couple questions. She wants to know a couple things. And the photos that you used of the African-American woman, that was just not her, but
those are actually 3 unidentified African-American women from our collection, which sort of, I thought was sort of poetically appropriate that we don't know them either. There are a lot of pieces of like that in our collection. So
Yeah, and she also asked, did you know any more about her son? Did you track him down at all?
That's one of the things that I was I think I would continue to research. He was a junior actually, so Lewis Miller, junior would be fairly easy to track down. The obituary for her father, as I said, listed 4 surviving grandchildren. It didn't detail their names. So, it's possible that he stayed in Paterson. He would have been about 17 or 18 when his mother died. I did look up the Andersons when the Reverend came back to Paterson to see if there were other people living in his household besides him and his wife, but it's just their other daughter, the surviving daughter, that's living with them. There don't seem to be any grandchildren with them, but yeah, I'm going to keep looking for him as well.
Okay, we've got some kudos from Bob and actually from Tamara and Rich, all thanking you for a wonderful presentation and hard work. Our own Sharon Briggs asked the question, did you contact or work with the First AME Zion Church?
Well, so that's another area that I kind of would like to examine and explore. I wasn't, initially really sure that there was a lot of a connection when it was just coming up that she was involved in the organization. But then as I got to understand her father's sort of connection to the AME Zion, I definitely think, church records or church minutes and things like that might be helpful to sort of reveal a little bit more about what she was involved in and what she's going on with. I'd really like to know a little bit more too about the House of Ruth and that organization. I found some research online, but it's a little bit like, looking up information about the Masons. There's like information that they tell, and then there's information that unless you remember, you'll never know. So like it took me forever to figure out that WR was worthy recorder. But yeah.
And a couple more, again, thank yous and good work from Jacqueline and Dennis as well. Just a couple things. In the chat box, I did put a link to our PayPal account. So if you feel so inclined, to make a donation to us, this donation supports us not only in these webinars, but also a lot of the other things that we're trying to do for the Paterson Museum. So anyway, it's there for your use if you feel so inclined. A question from Cheryl, actually. Would her son have been likely to attend school in Paterson? Do you think he might be included in one of the yearbooks, for example?
So I could look for him in a yearbook, and I hadn't done that. There seems to be some, it's a little unclear whether or not any of Minerva's family were attending school or not. She listed, as I mentioned, in the 1900 and 1910 census that she hadn't had any official schooling. But I actually found her family in one of the things I found yesterday in an early census when she was a school child, and it lists her as being a child at school in Rhode Island. So I don't know whether that means she was attending school like homeschooled and they just listed that in the census. But so I think probably based on the fact that her son was born in 1903, he would have attended some sort of formal school in Paterson. I don't know that he would have gotten to the point where he would have been in high school and in yearbooks, but it's definitely would be worth a shot to look for him.
Sure. Let's see, and again, a couple more thank yous from Joan and also from Peggy. Peggy Norris of Ridgewood Library fame and Bergen County, particularly historic preservation work, and her own series that she ran out of the Hermitage for many years. So I think, let's see. Okay, Tamara points out that there was a school for colored children that was built sometime near the AME church in the 1900s. So that might be another path to go look at, right? So if if we know a little bit more about that school, that might give us some indication, something about maybe Minerva had played a role with it. Who knows? So we could try that. Let's see. I have a note from Carol Evans. She says, again, thank you. An interesting program. A piece of trivia, she points out, the Canadian $10 bill, the first non-royal woman on a Canadian banknote, had a similar story, arrested for trying to go to a theater. And she puts a link for us to read that story. So So yeah, theaters played a big role here, and as we know, I mean, many of us know the history of theaters and, not only the acts, of course, that were going on stage, but also the audience too, and the segregation, things like that. So certainly that I'm sure that will be an interesting story as well to take a look at there up in Canada. So I want to thank Jack for being on tonight. I also want to thank the man behind the scenes tonight, is behind that logo of the Paterson Museum Foundation. That's Dave Ferrari. Dave is our secretary, and so he's been operating all the buttons and levers and mechanical stuff behind the scenes to make this happen tonight. And as you see, we've got a couple board members on. Cheryl Adamoff and Sharon Briggs are both on with us tonight as well. So if there's no more questions, I want to thank everyone for coming, and particularly thank Heather for this work. She's been working on this a long time.
Thank you.
This is one of her signature projects.
We're going to have to add to her title, instead of being just our curator that's making so many changes, now she's our history detective as well.
She's our history detective.
Our scholarship.
Exactly. She's our own history detective here.
I need a magnifying glass though.
She needs a magnifying glass and like a Sherlock Holmes hat too to go with it. So we want to thank her for that, and a note from Dave here thanking everyone for coming tonight. So again, keep an eye on our Facebook page. In the not too distant future, we'll be posting some more date announcements for more of these webinars, both the speaker series that we have tonight, as well as Ed Smike's own Stories Behind the Story, where he zeroes in on particular people and things and places in Passaic County history that really are pretty much unknown. That's what we call it, the Stories Behind the Story. So again, thank you so much, everyone. And Dave, I think we'll call it a night.